love some feedback on coloring without having to look on reference. I was trying really hard to just draw the outline and color from memory / just from memory, failed, and ultimately copying the exact same color off of the reference. So I think with this one, of course, we can look at the piece itself. I don't see a problem necessarily with just following the reference. I think it looks really nice. I think you've done a really nice job with the textures here and here as well. And the values also read quite nicely too. So I don't think that's necessarily an issue in itself, Synner, especially if you're still learning. I do think that when you're talking about the idea of not using references, it's almost like a cool party trick sort of thing. It's like, for example, being able to ride a unicycle blindfolded, it's like, the blindfolded part is probably what's gonna really impress people, but at the same time, I do think that if you're even not familiar with necessarily riding a unicycle, you shouldn't worry too much about that yet. I realize that that's a terrible analogy, but I hope you guys get what I mean. I think we should focus far more on just being confident with colors first. And it still comes down to using reference. However, here's one thing. Maybe instead of actually using one reference, my personal suggestion to you is to take multiple reference images. One, you can take for the subject matter. Second, you can take for the mood. And you try and apply the mood onto your first reference image's design. And that way, you're not blindly copying. Because I do think that the fear of a lot of people, and understandably so, is that they end up going to this mode of copying without necessarily digesting what they're learning. However, if you just change the parameters slightly, I think it will be just enough to be challenging, but at the same time, you're still having these training wheels on as well. So, with that said though, I'll still address the direct question that you have, which is how do you come up with a color scheme without actually looking? So, colors is also something very personal, but if you really do want to make something up, I would still say you cannot go wrong first with values, and secondarily, your colors will be influenced by the mood and all those things and lighting. And if you're going for a more, you can say, overcast day where it's gray sky, then I don't see what's wrong with your piece, because you can even take a stylistic choice, for example, and even make, for example, the foliage extra saturated because you want to create a bold statement with it that even amongst a gray and overcast day, that you will still be able to find bits of life that throughout the city. So color, there's no right way to do colors. But if you're talking about how do I maybe change the lighting of the scene and still keep it realistic, then we have a set of more specific parameters that we can begin to work with. So I guess what I'm trying to say is that your question is quite loaded in itself, So is there a specific color scheme that you're looking for here, Synner, or in terms of like a mood maybe, so we can maybe work off of that? But I do think values though is still one thing you can't go wrong with, because for example, let's just say that we want to add in certain lighting, direct lighting. I personally would even think about grouping some of the values. Like if there's a shadow side, for example, then I'm gonna start darkening maybe the areas in shadow a lot more, and assuming it's coming from the left here, for example, and the light is coming this way. So if it's a sphere, it's coming more this way. So first of all, I think alright, I'll try and directly answer the question. And Synner says, the main issue for me is after I painted, I'm unable to replicate anything. Can you clarify what you mean by that? Like as in applying it to your own subject matter, Synner? Perhaps? Figure out lighting direction. So I think that's always a good start. And then figure out the exposure. Alright, so this is how I would do it personally. I would just look at this first. So figure out the lighting direction. And second of all, I would even... You know what, I'll do it this way. This is how I would approach a lighting study. Focus on light shadow first. And I'll bring in a reference image as well, so I can show you guys how I would approach it. So let's just say we have this piece for lighting. So it's the idea that it's almost like a sunset, and because that there's hills or maybe clouds on the horizon, it's blocking out the bottom. And you can only see the light hitting the top of the building. And hello Jasmine, good to see you. How are you doing? So how are we going to replicate this? So first of all, I would do this. Figuring out the lighting direction first. And secondarily, focus on light and shadow first using two values. So I know that you're doing it traditionally, Synner, but you can always do a small thumbnail study on the side, for example, before applying it to your piece. So what I would do is I would figure out how to break down this reference into two values. Anything that's in shadow will be black, pure black, and anything that is in light will be pure white. So if I was doing my own separate study, it would probably look something like this. So don't worry about anything else but where the light is hitting and where the shadow is. This isn't the best reference image just because the values of the shadow and light are quite near, but let's just say it looks something like this, and including these little details. And I'll put everything else in light. And yeah, something like that. So one of the things that I'm noticing with this is that there's only a little bit of light near the top. So observe, try and understand what's happening here. And first of all, the lighting is coming from like the left, and the shadow is dominant at the bottom. So after doing that, if you're trying to apply it to your piece, for example, one of the things that you can do is just figure out where the shadow is hitting and where the light is. So try and once again copy what you see. So maybe in this case, let's just say if I had to go to the extreme of pure black and white, so I can see that perhaps most of the scene is in shadow. But then I'm gonna figure out only the top half of the building is gonna be in light. So maybe something like that. And you can maybe have the light slicing across the pole like this. It would look quite nice actually. This is the shadow. Then the ground would also be in shadow as well, because it's not being hit. And I know that this is an extreme version, but the key is to just first of all break down the scene into the most simple components, which is where the light and shadow is. Not thinking about the local colors at all just yet. And I'm actually gonna paint in the light area so it's a bit clearer, for example, what we're seeing. So if we're breaking it down, it would be something like this. Maybe a little bit peaking here as well. But as you can see, even with black and white, it already looks quite interesting here. And then what we have to then figure out is, where is the exposure? So exposure is something I've talked about on previous streams, but essentially it's where most of the value range will be. I'm sure you guys, when you've taken a shot using your mobile phone of a scenery, let's just say that the sun is really bright. Have you guys taken an image before where the light values are so bright that it's essentially just pure white? Or maybe the opposite, the shadows are so dark that it's essentially pure black, or you can barely differentiate it. So this is essentially what exposure determines, is where do you actually see the most value range. Generally, where something is exposed, the other part is under or overexposed. So the area in exposure has the most value range. And let's just say it's light. The exposure is in the light, therefore the shadow will have a narrower value range. So how does this work in practice? So let's just say, and hey Fer, great to see you, and thank you for the follow, David. Appreciate it. Welcome to the Stretchy Gang. So let's just say that I have this. So how do we actually figure out the exposure in a piece? That's the bigger question. And thank you for the follow, Can of Sardines. Welcome to the Stretchy Gang. And good to have you here. Alright, so we only have black and white, right? So how do we now determine what the area of exposure is? If you remember, area of, or exposed area, has higher range of value. So in this case, we only have two values, so we can't necessarily have a higher value range because we have like a perfect 50-50 split between shadow and light. However, what if we introduced a third value? So by this logic, where do we want the exposure to be? And where that exposure is, we're going to introduce this third gray value, mid-gray value. So in this case of the reference image, if we want the exposure to be in the light, then we are going to color in the castle with a darker value, perhaps. If the castle is darker than the sky. So essentially we're allowing more values to describe the local colors. So let's just say we had to round up all of the colors, or at least try and define as much of it with just these two values. Then this might be one of the options, and maybe the sky can be a bit darker as well too, so it's not completely flat. So as you can see, just by introducing a gray value, the image looks much more defined, and it looks like, oh yeah, the castle is actually a bit darker than the sky. And then maybe the river as well is also darker too. So for example, it looks something like that. And this is if the exposure is in the light. What if we did it the other way around though? So what if the exposure was in the shadow? So instead of adding the gray value into the light area, we're going to introduce it in the shadow area. So if we look at the original reference image as well, you will see that the castle is a bit brighter than the grass. So what I'm gonna do is just clip in the gray value here and describe the castle as being brighter than the grass. Something like that. And it definitely looks incomplete now. And just because I think the composition tends to lend itself a little bit better to having the exposure. Yeah, having a little bit more values to describe the scene, at least if you want the exposure and the shadow. But it'll probably look something like that. So in this case, we have to then determine, do we want the exposure to be in the light or in the shadow? If we want it to be in the light area, then we're going to add in the gray value to the light areas. So looking at the original image, it seems like the wood is darker or the roof is darker, for example. So maybe I'll introduce the gray value here. Then the pole seems to be darker. So as you can see, just by introducing the gray value, we're now describing a lot more of the differences in local color in the scene. And after that, if you feel like that's not enough, you can now add in the 4th and 5th values. So let's just say that you feel like there's not enough values to describe the light area. Then we can introduce this value over here. However, remember what we said as well, that the area of exposure has higher range of value. So if we split it into 3 values versus 2, we still have a higher value range in the area of exposure. So we're going to maybe add in more color here because the wood is a little bit darker, it's not pure white. But now we're also given a 5th value to add in more description within the shadow area too. So maybe this is a bit lighter. Maybe I'll change this to normal, just so it's a bit clearer. Cactus says this is the only exposure artists want to hear about. I think people do confuse it. Sometimes I talk about exposure and people think I'm talking about dealing with clients or like that kind of exposure. But I can assure you that's not the kind of exposure I'm talking about. Well, happy to hear you're finding it useful, Sardines. But as you can see, even just by adding on these extra values, you can slowly see that the image is taking shape. So you'll notice that I'm not even looking at the colors right now, but I'm just trying to understand, first of all, where the lighting direction is coming from. Then really just figure out where the lighting is hitting. And then after that, figuring out the exposure so I can figure out where to allocate my values and making sure that I have a clear distinction between them. And I'm sure a lot of you guys have heard of muddy values. And that's what happens when the split between the color range in the light and shadow are exactly the same. So maybe you'll have some values in the shadow that are exactly the same in the light, you know. So by splitting it in this way, you can ensure that you have a much clearer read. And of course, then after you figure out the values, you can then assign colors to it as well. So in this case, when you've already established the values, it'll be much easier to figure out the colors. I can even just apply a color layer on top of everything right now. And I'm even just gonna color pick a bit. And I'm gonna make this a bit lighter because pure black, you know, well, it tends to not read so clearly now. So I'm gonna brighten it up a bit. And it seems to be blue, you know, so I'm just deciding on the hue now. Because what is color? Color is essentially hue plus saturation plus value. But guess what we've already figured out from doing this? We figured out our values. So all we have to do is figure out our hue and saturation. And hey Cheeky, good to see you again, man. How are you doing? So after we figured out the value, here's my tip. If you want to choose the right color saturation, just look at the image and try and figure out, you know, what hue it approximately is. Here it's somewhat orangish. So we're going to go to our color wheel, go to the orange. And after that, we can then choose to push the saturation a bit to the right. Because the further right you go to a color wheel, the more saturated it is. So maybe like this, and then it's a little bit bluer for the shadow. So I'm just gonna speed through it a little bit here. So anything in the shadow area, I'm gonna make it cool. And anything in the light area, I'm gonna make it warmer. And maybe I'll lower the saturation a bit. And on top of that as well, now we can add in the local colors, you know, so maybe we can introduce it with a another color layer on top with a little bit less opacity. So I'm just gonna bring back the original colors that you've had, Synner. So maybe you have a wooden color here. And I believe the gate, let's just assume it's red. You'll notice that because we already have the value structure provided, just by adding the color layer on top, you know, we still maintain that clarity of read. Notice how with me turning off the color layer on, it's virtually still got the value structure intact. You know, the yellow road, for example. Maybe the roof, it's a bit darker. For example. And then you have a bit more of the foliage here as well. And of course, if you feel like you need to make a little bit of a value adjustment, feel free to do so. Just using like an adjustment layer at the bottom. And of course, let's not forget adding in the color of the sky as well. But essentially, if you've already got your values figured out, colors will really fall in place much easier after that. So trying to understand all of these points on the side, I think will make it much easier for you to actually then replicate it into your own study, Synner. Because I think when we're copying, we're not understanding all of the steps along the way to get to that place. So if we can at least break down lighting into these separate steps, I feel like it just makes things a lot easier after that. But here may be the big question for you, Synner. It's like, how do I then apply it traditionally? So this is, one way to do it digitally. However, if let's just say you've done a study like that, now we can at least maybe bring in, darker color like blue, and then we can just glaze it over, right? So as you can see, just by adding the shadows in the same place as it was before. Now we suddenly get the mood that we're looking for. So if you're doing watercolor, do the local colors first and then make the darker shadows, using a different color like this. And of course, the sky needs adjustment too. And maybe glaze in a little bit of warmer colors here too. So now you almost have a little bit more of an old anime style background here. So yeah, I know it's a little bit of a long-winded response to your question, but this is how I generally take lighting from a different scene and apply it to my own piece. So just to recap, figure out the lighting direction of your reference image. That's crucial. Second of all, focus on light and shadow first using 2 values. That would break things down into very digestible chunks. So at the very least, if you do this with your traditional pieces, Synner, just knowing where your shadows fall, that would already do half the battle for you. But, if you're doing a much more finished painting when it comes to like digital, exposure would be something extra important to figure out. And the way that you figure out an area that's more exposed is where you have a greater range of values. Where there is an area of exposure, the opposite will have a narrower range. So if you have your exposure in light, you will have more range of values than in the shadows, and vice versa. So start by introducing a 3rd value. And when you feel like that's not enough, introduce a 4th and 5th one, and ad infinitum pretty much. But this is how I would say you can build up your confidence with values, creating your own lighting scenarios, and so on and so forth. Oh, I see, Synner. And hey, Yari, great to see you, man. How are you doing? So these are just general tips to approach studies. And let's just say we're gonna very quickly replicate that scene, to our own piece. Again, so just so you guys can see it in action. So I'm just gonna replicate a scene or like a composition that I've done before. Or just something very similar. So once again, you have your line work. Now, where is the lighting? Where's the shadow and light? So first of all, I remember that the lighting is coming from the left. So first of all, I'm just gonna put all right facing objects in shadow, and then after that I remember that there's a slice of light coming from the top and only the top area is exposed. Therefore, everything in the shadow is in, or anything below is in shadow. And then I'm gonna introduce the mid-gray values. So I want the exposure to be here. And I'm gonna do the sky as well. Oh, wrong tool. And then I'm gonna introduce the 4th and 5th values to help shape. The 4th value, I think. Add it here. So the foliage in the foreground would be darker, and I think I'll even make some parts brighter too. And add some patterns here. Then of course after that, if I feel like there's insufficient values, I can always add in a bit more as well as time goes on. So yeah, just a very quick way of recapping of what I learned from that study, and if I was to apply it to my own piece, how that would look like. And of course you can add in some separation as well here too, and so on and so forth. But yeah, don't want to get carried away with this. So hopefully that answers your question, Synner, and we can move on to the next one. And Peku says, just finished this one today. Wanted to know how the cloth is looking, especially with how the light bounces off through the fabric. Does it look real? Does there need to be more texture in general? Also, how's the composition, and does anything in particular look off? Thank you. Alright, so first of all, I think it's a really cool idea. Is it actually literally like a dragon in a barrel, or a magical creature somehow that is half barrel, half dragon? I think composition wise, there's not too much to say. It looks really nice. So one of the things I'd say is that when it comes to the composition, you know, we can I think we can make it more dynamic. I don't know if that's what you're going for, because it does look like you're trying to go for something a little bit more storybook-like. So the flatness, almost like the flatness of it can be a aesthetic in itself. But when it comes to composition, I'll just address that first. So one of the things that I immediately see is that this lends itself very, very nicely to a strong triangular composition like that. So I really would like to emphasize a lot of the gestures of the dragon and the flames to suit that as well. So one of the things that I do one thing that I think that makes, so I'll just make some notes. Dynamic composition has a lot of depth and movement. So what does that actually mean? So if you guys remember from the previous stream when I was talking about how I go about shape designing and creating landscapes, one of the things that I do is that I like to use triangles a lot. Why triangles? Because it lends itself very nicely to, you know, a funneling movement of sorts, or it directs a viewer's eye because it naturally looks like an arrow. And on top of that as well, a triangle can give the illusion of depth, because if I line up these triangles in such a way, this will probably remind you of a landscape where a lot of the triangular shapes funnel in towards a certain focal point. It has strong directional capabilities. Triangles have strong directional capabilities and also can mimic depth through perspective. So any chance that I get to introduce a triangle, I will. So how will this work as well? So for example, I'm seeing that maybe one of the things we can do is that we can have, actually before I go into that, one of the things as well that I've been studying recently when it comes to my paintings is that areas which are not as important, I'll keep it broad. Areas that are not as important, I will keep the shape broad. And of course detail density as well. However, what does that actually mean? So with the foreground, I like to keep my shapes really big. So if I actually pop open one of my studies, just for a concrete example, notice how the foreground shape is very broad here. I started off like this, and you'll notice that a lot of the shapes here are big, you know. But at the same time, you'll notice that they're all kind of converging towards the center. It's pointing, but then the path kind of brings you up as well. And here, and then there's another line that goes here. But you'll notice that the shapes here get a lot smaller. So essentially, nearer to the focal point, the shapes get smaller in order to keep your attention there. Same thing here, bigger, broader shapes. But then here, I'm going to have a lot smaller shapes as I get in closer. So notice how just through different sizes of shapes, you can naturally create this sense of direction and depth. So we can apply exactly the same thing to yours, Peku. So I would personally even make the wing bigger. So this one might be tricky. I think I'll have to do a natural paint over. So I want one of the wings perhaps to come into the foreground and make the make the shapes much bigger. And the other one, I'd even minimize. So I don't know what the opposite of exaggerate is. Desaturate, minimize. But in any case, I'll make it smaller. And that alone will already create the illusion that, you know, the dragon is coming towards you at some part. So other parts we can emphasize. Maybe this leg can be bigger too. And I would say even pop out the silhouette more. So don't be afraid to just have the limbs pop out. And with this, no. Maybe having the tail. Once again, triangle shape, big triangles here. Really exaggerated. Don't be afraid to do that. And with the tap as well, you know, just pop it out a bit more. Anything that cannot be seen in the silhouette will just take a back seat. Can be done intentionally, but in this case, I think it'll be a darn shame not to have that pop out. And on top of that as well, with the flames, you can make it nice, big and broad. So as if we are the ones being incinerated as the viewer. So notice how I'm literally just using triangles here. I'm drawing triangles. But later on, you can carve the shape, refine it a bit more. But as a general gesture, similar to when we're drawing characters, for example, we're going to use exaggerated shapes, right? So we're going to use triangles, for example. And of course, we're not literally going to keep it that way. However, later on, we're going to now flesh the shapes a bit more. And in the same way, that's what I'm trying to do with the flames. Is that I'm just creating something gestural. and refining it later. Remember, big broad shapes, then the shapes can go smaller to indicate depth. And if you remember from first paint over last week, gang, as I said, try and repeat your shapes as well. So if you have a spark that's this size in the foreground, if you have a spark this size in the background, what does that actually mean? Oh, well, it shows that there's depth and perspective. So repetition of shapes at different depths, same size, can give illusion of depth. I think I should change it to white. I think red makes it feel like I'm just screaming this. So I'm just gonna make the gesture cleaner as well. Alright, so onto the cloth. I would say that it depends where we're looking at. Generally though, considering the light source that's so diffuse, it's hard to really say. However, generally cloth has a bit of transparency, so usually in the middle, you know, you're gonna have a little bit of like the whatever is behind it kind of show through. So in this case, I'm gonna allow maybe if the skylight to go through. Actually, no, sorry about that. When something goes through, it tends to become more saturated too. So it's essentially subsurface scattering. I'm not too sure of the exact phenomenon, but what you're gonna do is just grab the color, make it a bit brighter, because contrary to popular belief, the subsurface scattering is not light. It's considered a shadow. So you're gonna keep the value range similar, but you're gonna like push the saturation all the way up. As you can see, that gives the illusion of like, oh, light shining through. And if you want to see a very clear example of it, go outside, see some leaves with sunlight filtering through it, and you'll notice that the leaves, despite the fact that it's technically in shadow, it's facing away from the light, it's still very saturated. So the same thing here. However, parts that are getting hit more by the light, we can, you know, make it a bit more, make it reflect that a bit more. So now we have a clear distinction of what is being hit by light versus what is actually subsurface scattering. Now in the light area, then that's where you see a little bit of that transparency. But in shadow, that's where you see the subsurface scattering. And of course, to emphasize that whole look of cloth, you know, just add some tatters, wear and tear. Just in some parts. We don't want the dragon to feel like absolutely like ragged, you know. But that can always help define the material a bit, and just to add a bit of a color accent, you know, maybe have like a sewn patch. And Jasmine says, repetition of shapes to create depth. Throwing in hook to maybe add to this instant noodle shape. It seems fitting, no? I think I'll do it for another one, just because in this case it's strictly to do with shape, like the usage of like shapes. But I do want to, you know, eventually make other videos that cover like how to create stronger compositions, similar to what I covered before. And another thing as well here, Peku, is try and be careful of repetition of similar size shapes. You'll notice that the eye is similar to like the flame size, and any repetition of shapes will tend to dilute it, of the same size that is. So be careful about that, but good thing that the value is more or less the same. But you know, maybe make the eye bigger or try and emphasize it in different ways too. And if it's actually like painted on, maybe try adding like smudge paint, for example. So I'm just using a smudge tool here. So you want to give that look that it is paint and not naturally occurring on the barrel. So as you can see, and it introduces some soft edges, which will allow the harder edge, eyes to kind of stand out a bit more. But still, adding some lost edges there, I think, can help. And Peku says, "Damn, its shape looks way more dynamic now. Good cloth material tips too. Did not think about cloth reflection." And Cactus says, "Oil paintings are luminescent looking in real life because of subsurface scattering. The light goes through the paint surface and reflects off of the suspended pigment particles. Fun fact." Oh yeah, that's really cool to know. That's why I don't think it's ever satisfactory when you see some of the paintings digitally. And also on top of that as well, don't be afraid to make your metals more bright as well. And some of the areas darker. If we're talking about exposure, I realize you're trying to add bounce light, but try and be a bit more conservative in some areas. And don't be afraid to increase the like you already have quite a stylized concept, so don't be afraid to really stylize your materials too. So having the wooden grain. So I think that would then help out with there we go. And of course a bit more light here as well. And Peku also says, "I realized that I've been quite shy about features. You really made it come more alive and brave by exaggerating for him." It can be tricky. I will say I was very conservative about it at one point, but I think that sometimes don't be afraid to really break it. And I think that's where I really appreciated that when I was doing gesture studies. You'll notice how crazy poses can get. And I thought that why does it really have to just stick to characters, or why can't other disciplines practice gestures just as much as character artists do? So that's why even in my architecture I really try and exaggerate the gestures as well, and you'll notice that even my buildings kind of curve a bit. But with that said, the perspective's kind of jank. And thank you for the follow and the prime sub, Nefas. Welcome to Stretchy Gang. Really appreciate it. Alright, so hopefully that helped, Peku. So what I'm gonna do is save this out and link it to you. And we can move on to the next one. So Niku says, "I was just looking for any general composition or landscape tips, but if there's anything you notice, you can let me know." Alright, I'll just focus on those first. So I'll focus on the composition. I think honestly like the lighting and the values look pretty good. I think we can work on that still a bit more, but let's focus on one thing at a time. So I think in this case, because you're doing an illustration, and it looks like it's almost like a card format, so I will stick to that. However, one of the things that I'm noticing, so maybe some of you guys probably can guess what I'm about to say, but one of the issues right now is that there is a lot of similar shape sizes throughout the piece. And even when it comes to the way that the landscape is designed, this is one of the things that really happens a lot. I think when people are starting off with it, but let me draw it out. So I'll simplify this to a triangle. And I don't know if you guys can see this already, but we have a lot of repeated parallel shapes. Not necessarily a wrong thing, but when you're talking about natural landscape, it feels way too contrived, because very rarely would things repeat in such a manner. And also on top of that as well, based on what we were talking about earlier, we want to avoid a lot of the shapes being the same size, because if we want to show scale and depth, we have to vary it up. The shape size you have here should be bigger than the one in the background. It's similar. So we'll address that first. So first of all, I actually think I'm not even gonna have this foreground element. Why? Because I think that this is one of those compositions where the character in the foreground is the focal point and should not have anything else really competing with it. So I'm gonna simplify the foreground first. And I'm actually going to now reduce the asymmetry. So one of the cool things that's already happening here is that, you know, you have like a nice triangular shape here, and the arms are kind of pointing this way. So rather than having another parallel shape, maybe like that, maybe I'll try and add a contra or like contrasting flow. Since the body is pointing this way, the arms pointing this way, and you can see the ears are pointing that way and the leg as well. You know, it'll be nice to have something pointing the other direction. So I'm actually gonna reduce this. Maybe it'll work better the other way, but at least from an instinctual level, I think this will work better. Yeah, alright, I think that works quite well. So I'm gonna simplify it to a triangle, the magic shape. And this kind of creates an asymmetry. The shape here is much bigger than the one on the left. I don't want it to be like this. Or if you do want it to have rocks of similar size, maybe if you have to, maybe go up only like this high, so that the triangles are more like this. So you have an asymmetry going on. We don't want an even split down the bottom. We want it to be asymmetrical. So something like that. And I'm now going to address the mountains in the background too. Same deal. I am actually, this time, since it's going this way, I'm now gonna have the mountains go this way. So you'll notice, so what I'm doing here is, alright, I'll introduce a new concept for today. I don't think I really covered it. There is an official term for it, but think of flow of the image and contrapposti, I don't know, something like that. Let me Google it up very quickly. Contraposition. If anyone knows, let me know, because contrapposto. I believe that's it. Contrapposto. There we go. Thank you, guys. Yeah. So posto. So I know that it tends to apply to characters. Like for example, if you have a character that is looking this way, like the statue of David, you know, if the body is turning this way, then you maybe want the leg turning this way, so you have like a twist, you know. And in an environment, the way that I think about it, you want to zigzag. So you have one facing this way, so therefore you want to try and have the other face the other way. So in this case, you have this going this way, so therefore you want it to go this way for whatever is behind it. If that makes sense, guys. I'm sure that there's a proper term for it, but I'm gonna refer to it as contrapposto for landscapes. So I'm gonna now have that. But in this case, I don't want it to end here because it's creating a tangent. I want to actually offset it. And guess what happens when you do that, guys? You are now allowing the silhouette of the character to pop out from the back. And you're creating a symmetry as well. So throughout the length of the canvas, this is like 10%, this is 90. And instead of creating a tangent, you are now offsetting it enough. Yeah, zigzag gang. So maybe to sound less pretentious, just do a zigzag. So I'm now going to do the mountains. And of course, you don't have to fully follow it. You can like change it up a bit. I'm actually gonna remove this. Oh no. And I can have another mountain in the background. So if that one is going here, this one's going here, I want one maybe that's going here. So instead of splitting it at the top of the line here, so if you consider this to be one shape, rather than splitting it at the top, this one I'm going to split it at the bottom. So maybe something like that. So you're creating zigzag, but you don't want a literal zigzag where it's... You don't want a literal zigzag like this. So what I'm trying to do is that maybe start from here. And for this other one, I want to start maybe lower, you know, so you can have another zigzag. It doesn't mean you can't have it at the top, but I'm trying to create other ways of contrast here. There's no official term for it, but I tend to find that just by varying like the way that you cut your proportions, that helps a lot. And the further things go in background, I believe it gets a bit cooler due to atmosphere. So we're gonna make it so. And let's shape the mountain. So back to what we were saying, we want the shapes to be smaller. So each triangle would be much smaller here. But with that said, I don't want it to be too prominent. This is like the main mountain here. So I want to make that a bit more prominent. So this is where the smaller shapes will come in, guys. Whereas the ones in the foregrounds are big shapes here. So if I'm adding like a ambient occlusion, it'll probably look a bit more like, you know, this big, for example. So once again, difference. Oh. Zigzag, zigzag. So this one, of course, we want the... I don't know how it explodes, so... And lastly, let's try and compare the shape. It seems to be the same size as the body, so I actually want to make the explosion smaller. So it's not always just the size of like different elements. The same elements, but it could be very different things. So in this case, I'm looking at the explosion. And However, maybe you can have debris coming closer in the form of triangles. It all makes sense now. So tiny. And the shape repetition would then create a sense of perspective too. And maybe you can have like something that's being hit here, you know, off screen. Hit by zigzag triangles, what a way to go. I think it's quite beautiful. I don't know about you. And of course, now we can add in all of the lava back, or magma. I know that there's a I think magma is underground, so I believe it's lava. So here's what I'm gonna do, guys. Triangles. Small triangles. So it's almost like a Fibonacci sequence. Triangle, everything. Everything's triangles. So when it gets here, this is where you'd have the smallest triangles. But then everything else will be big, and the lava stream here would be much larger. And when it comes to lighting, we can always just add back in some of the, you know, rim lighting into the piece too. And of course, there's gonna be the rock faces are gonna be a bit more reflective too, so we can't discount that. So I'm not gonna cover Fresnel again this time round. I feel like that's one of the things, but in general, the more perpendicular a surface is to our eyes, the less reflective it'll be, but the more parallel, the more reflective it'll be. That's why surfaces in the distance tend to be more reflective somehow than the ones in the foreground. And of course, you want to add in the small details too. So breaking up the bigger triangles into smaller ones so you can get a sense of depth. Once again, big triangles in the foreground, small triangles in the background. And we can have reflection in this from the sky. But I think one of the things you did really well here, Niku, is that you actually did do the exposure quite nicely. I just reduced this a bit, and I know that there's, even when it comes to lighting, one of the things to keep in mind is that asymmetrical. So what you have here is that there's a 50-50 split when it comes to the lighting, the light, and the shadow. We don't want that. We want an asymmetrical split. Like that. And of course, we want ambient occlusion where it's appropriate. And we have the good old subsurface scattering, but I'm gonna make that darker just because it's still in the shadow. Cactus says, this poor dude's chances of survival got a lot worse with his paint over. And Niku also says, no worries, I know what Fresnel is. At least the basic definition. It's a very good idea to add it. Great tip so far. And he's doing cactus. And yeah, so instead of changing the values, just add grays. Just shift your colors to a gray, and you'll get like a nice cool look to it. So even here as well, I'm just literally shifting the color to gray. The values don't change much, but it makes it feel, yeah, it makes it feel like it's being hit by the skylight more. And yeah, anything that's top facing will not be in light. So you have to figure out, is the bounce light motivating the lighting, most of the lighting, or is it gonna be the light from the sky? So I think we have to choose in this case. And yeah, as a last touch, just use a multiply layer, I would say, to make the foreground a bit darker, I think. And even here, I think it's just... And as a last part, just using a screen layer to create a bit of atmosphere, create a bit of glow from the atmosphere to make it feel much more physical. Oh. I think even a bit of overlay. Let's give it a try. Maybe it's too much. Yeah, and of course, just adding a bit of dramatic sky as well. I think that would really help things. Just to add like some small shapes into the sky, the background. Just to make it feel more ominous as well, I think. Maybe here it's like getting... But alright, I would say this is it then for the paint over. And we can do a quick before and after. So in terms of values as well. So hopefully that helps, Niku. And I'll be sending it over to you. Awesome, happy to hear that. Save a copy. And I will tag you as well. Niku. Yeah, that's a really big thing that I learned a couple years back from my friend. And yeah, just creating a symmetrical lighting helps so much. And that's the name of the game. Lighting, composition, shapes, proportions, everything has to be asymmetrical if you want it to be dynamic. So yeah, that's really the secret to all of this. But yeah, I think it's a good piece though overall. I think it's just a matter of making the composition more dynamic. I like what you did with the lava in the foreground, so I think I lost it a little bit with the paint over, but yeah, you know, you can always bring that back. So yeah, I think this will be the last paint over, guys. So we have like 2 minutes 50 seconds left to the stream, but hopefully you guys enjoyed it this time. Even though we don't have as many pieces to go through, I'll try and figure out something to maybe have paint overs submitted ahead of the stream, so the viewer doesn't have to be here, for example. So we'll at least have a steady stream of pieces and not have to wait too long, and avoid the possibility of having a stream where no one submits a piece. I think it's a nice range though of pieces. So just to recap, this is the one from Synner. So we were just covering how to apply different lighting scenarios to different pieces and making it your own. And we also did a paint over for Peku, just focusing on how to make the design of the character and the pose much more dynamic. And lastly, Niku's piece, where we focus mostly on how to create a more dynamic composition as well. Awesome, glad to hear that, gang. Jasmine says, one day I'll have decent pieces to submit and not my cobbled together Frankenstein stuff. That's fair enough. Yeah, once again, thank you to Cactus for being very generous and gifting a feedback to Niku. So I think I'll wrap up the stream here, guys. So thank you so much for watching. I really enjoyed it, and I'm glad to hear that you guys have enjoyed it as well. So we'll be back again next week for another feedback stream. So if you want your piece critique, then be sure to save up on the points, or just in the meantime leave your piece in the feeds and crit section on the Discord server, which you can find here in the chat. So be sure to join that as well to be part of an awesome community of artists such as the ones you see in the chat. And until next time, gang, take care, and as always, stay stretchy. Thanks for watching, and I hope you enjoyed the video. If you'd like feedback done on your very own piece, then be sure to head on over to my Twitch and give me a follow, where I do feedback sessions like this every week.